This project has been going on for 6 weeks, and today was the first day I was able to fit the battery that I've made into the bike I bought to see if the idea for the electric motorcycle I had in my head worked in reality. The start of the week didn't go so well. The first thing on my list was to 3D print the faceplate for the box. This would incorporate the handle, the multi-plugs, and fixing and sealing the actual battery box itself together. I actually started by 3D printing the handle. I wanted to improve the quality of my prints, so I actually put my printer inside a cupboard inside my house, which is nice and consistent temperature and there's no breezing, which will hopefully improve the consistency of the 3D prints. And it turned out great, so I decided to move on to the end plate of the battery box. This was a slightly more complex thing to design. It had to sit nicely over the end of the battery box. It had to also press up against the cell unit itself to keep that nice and tight. And it also had to incorporate the handle and the multi-plugs. I also decided to make these captive nuts inside the cell spacer. Once I had it designed, it was then time to put it into Cura to get it sliced. This would hopefully be a nice easy thing to print because it had a lovely big flat surface which would contact perfectly with the build plate of the 3D printer. In the printing settings, I decided to increase the infill percentage so it was a nice strong part because it's got to be structurally sound. And I also decreased the layer height. It means it takes a little bit longer to print, but it means that the actual layers are slightly less distinct and it looks slightly nicer. Also, it's a little bit stronger. So I got it loaded up on my printer and set the print off. Unfortunately, the first one failed. The corner of the actual product lifted off the print bed. I then went back to the printer settings, added a brim to the item so it'd have more of a contact to the build plate, and set the second print overnight. And again it failed, and for a completely different reason. This time, the nozzle on the printer head jammed. This meant nothing came out and nothing was extracted. Fortunately, it was already about 75% of the way through, so I can use it for my mock-up. Even though it's not a perfectly finished item, I'm going to have to reprint it again. You can see it didn't print the part which will slide into the case, only the external part. But for now, I can get the whole battery box mocked up. These are another part I printed during the week. This is a negative and positive bus bar that will be mounted inside the battery case. This will make the connection between the battery and the multi-plugs. A section of bus bar is slid through this housing. It then has a couple of fixing bolts attached. These fixing bolts will have a high ampage connector and cable which will run to each terminal on the multi-plug. And the reason I can't just run a wire from the actual battery to the multi-plug is because of the high ampage. I can't have a single point of pickup from the battery cells. So I need to take off a few points from the battery cell to go to the bus bar, and then we've got a single point from the bus bar to the connector. This means you can spread out the load across the whole of the cell. Now I can get the plate assembled. I've got two multi-plugs. One is for the feed to the motor, the other is for the charger. This AMP connector can take the 20 amps that the charger will output. And this is the high ampage Amphenol connector. Turns out I ordered 4mm bolts instead of 3s, so I can't bolt it in place for today. In my head, before starting this project, I knew I wanted to mount the battery within the frame rails. This is much safer from any side impact. I offered up a few situations, but it looked pretty tight inside there. I had to remove unnecessary parts from the frame. These are mounting points and brackets that won't be used in the electric motorcycle conversion that were needed for the combustion engine. Quickly ground off the ones that are in the way. And a flappy disc just to make sure I wouldn't cut myself. I'll dress all this nicely and finish it up later. It seemed that the only way to get the battery into the bike was to slide it from underneath and fix it in place. I didn't really want this because I wanted to be able to remove the battery once it was fitted to the bike. The biggest thing that was in the way was this tank mount. It has side fixings on the side for the tank cover, which I will be using, but I'm going to get rid of the tank mount. this removed, the battery slid in a treat. Also, at this point, I realised that with the tank cover removed, the actual battery would be able to slide in from the top, which was exactly what I wanted. You also have the charging socket readily available up the top, which I can make an easy access hatch to later on. Although it's not horizontal like I originally wanted it, the angle it sits at sits really nicely with the tank cover and fits in a treat. I was happily surprised how it turned out. It fits nice, it looks good. There's loads of room for the controller to sit on top, also loads of room for the motor to be underneath. I then need to look into how to fix this. I knew I wanted it to be in a frame so it'd be nice and secure. The only thing I had about at hand was aluminium angle iron. I did thread a couple of pieces of this L-shaped aluminium beside it just to see what it would look like, and I've decided to go for this system, obviously with the steel that I can weld into the frame. This means that the battery box will slide into these rails, and I'll just make a clamp system that will go on here and will hold it in place. I've actually now ordered the motor and controller. It's a few weeks away, but it'll be here soon, so I can get this nicely solidly mounted in the next couple of weeks, and then it's time to get the motor and everything fitted in. We've also been working on some of the electrical problems. The motor, controller, all sorted, no problem at all, but we want a dash. So we've been working on an LCD screen that will hopefully show everything, including battery life and road mileage, all in one handy little display. That'll come up in a few weeks, hopefully.